The snow had already piled knee-deep against the windows when I saw the set of footprints leading away from the lodge. They were fresh, pressed into the powder that had fallen just an hour earlier. What unsettled me wasn't that someone had gone outside in the middle of the night, but that the tracks didn't circle back. They ended at the edge of the tree line and seemed to vanish into the dark as if whoever made them had been swallowed whole by the storm. If you're listening tonight, let me know where you are. I'm always curious who shares these long, quiet hours. And if these stories keep you company, feel free to subscribe so you'll never miss the next one. My name is Donna Ellis. I was 37 then, working nights at a mountain lodge just outside Leadville, Colorado. I'd taken the job after a divorce when I thought a change of scenery might give me space to start again. The lodge was built in the 1950s, all heavy timbers and wide stone fireplaces, the kind of place families came to ski during winter breaks or couples booked for anniversaries. In the off-season, though, it was quiet enough that you could go an entire shift without seeing another soul. That December was different. A snowstorm had rolled in early, cutting the mountain roads to little more than single lanes of slush and ice. Guests were stranded, and one of them a man who arrived after dark without luggage or even a reservation left me with a memory I've never shaken. His name never made it into the logbook. He signed only with initials, illegible loops that meant nothing. I started calling him the quiet man in my head. He came through the door just as Len Turner, our night maintenance man, was laying fresh salt on the entry steps. The wind followed him in lifting loose flakes off the carpet. He said almost nothing, only asked for a room with a window facing east. His voice was even deliberate without inflection. I remember his coat was old-fashioned wool with large black buttons, and his shoes left no snow on the mat. That detail only struck me later. Len was a talker by nature. He tried to draw the man into small conversation about the storm, about how the plows might not reach us until morning. The quiet man simply nodded and placed two $20 bills on the counter for a single night's stay. No credit card, no ID. At the time, I chalked it up to being old-fashioned or cautious. The storm had already knocked out phone lines once that week, so I didn't press him. He took the key without a word and disappeared down the hallway. I can still picture how he walked hands loose at his sides, each step measured, as though he'd memorized exactly how far apart to place his feet. The lodge settled into silence after he vanished upstairs. Len and I stayed near the fireplace in the lobby, listening to the hiss of logs and the whine of wind against the eaves. At some point close to midnight, I decided to make a round of the hallways. It was something I always did during storms, partly to check windows, and partly because the long, empty corridors unsettled me if I didn't. The second-floor wing smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. Most of the rooms were empty that week, their doors propped open to air out the stale heat. When I passed the quiet man's room, I noticed his door was not only closed, but locked from the inside. The faint sound of a radio leaked out. Not music static rising and falling, like someone was slowly turning the dial and never settling on a station. I moved on quickly, telling myself it was nothing. Guests were entitled to their privacy. Yet as I returned downstairs, I felt the strange certainty that he had been standing right behind the door. As I passed, listening to the sound of my footsteps. Around 1 in the morning, Len said he was heading out to check the backup generator near the utility shed. He pulled on his parka, muttering about how the snow was drifting across the side paths already. I stayed at the desk, sorting through reservation cards until I heard the faint slam of the outer door closing. Minutes stretched long, punctuated only by the groan of the furnace. That was when I noticed the footprints. Through the glass doors of the lobby, the snow outside reflected pale under the security lamp. A line of impressions cut straight from the side exit toward the woods, sharp-edged and recent. I waited for Len to reappear in view, but the prints didn't lead to the generator shed. They veered sharply away into the trees. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No sign of him. I slipped on my coat and boots and opened the door just enough to feel the sting of snow whip across my face. The night was so still that the crunch of my first step onto the drifts echoed like glass breaking. I followed the tracks until they reached the tree line, but beyond that the snow was untouched. No path back, no disturbed branches, no continuation deeper into the woods. Just a sudden end, as if the storm had erased the rest in an instant. When I came back inside, the lobby felt colder, though the fire was still burning. The desk bell rang once, clear and deliberate. I hadn't seen anyone enter. I looked toward the counter, and the quiet man's key lay on top of the register. His room upstairs was dark when I checked it. The bed hadn't been turned down, and the window was cracked open, though the snow was pressed thick against the screen. On the desk sat an old pocket radio, hissing faintly with static, its dial glinting under the dim light. Len returned nearly an hour later through the main entrance, shaking snow from his shoulders. He said the generator had been running fine, and when I asked if he'd gone out the side door, he looked at me blankly. He hadn't. He'd never left that way. I wanted to tell him about the tracks, about the room, about the radio. Instead, I said nothing. Some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. The man had arrived without a sound and left the same way. But when I locked the lobby doors for the night, I couldn't stop glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see fresh prints leading away again. And even now, years later, I still wonder what would have happened if I'd followed them deeper into the woods. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people pause and study your face, trying to decide whether you're exaggerating or whether they should be worried it could happen to them too. Back when I was 29, I worked nights at a hospital in Eugene, Oregon. I was on the cardiology floor, long shifts that left me drained but restless. Running had always been my way of clearing my head. After a string of 12-hour nights, I'd lace up my shoes and head out to the river trail before the sun came up. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet you only get along water where sound carries strangely, and the world feels a little detached from itself. This night in November was different. The fog was so thick it swallowed the streetlights. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me as I parked my car in the small gravel lot near the trailhead. The air was damp and cold. Clinging to my clothes before I'd even started jogging, I remember glancing at my phone as I stretched. It was 4:12 in the morning. My sister Megan had texted earlier asking if I'd ever considered running at a normal hour. I'd laughed it off. The truth was, the strange hours made me feel safe. I rarely saw anyone else on the trail. That morning, the fog pressed down in a way that made me feel like I was moving through a tunnel of milk. Each step along the paved path echoed against the water, muffled but distinct. My breath came out in little white clouds. I told myself it was just another run, that the fog was nothing to dwell on. About 10 minutes in, I began hearing it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself it was in my head. A humming, low, tuneless, drawn out like someone repeating the same note again and again. I slowed my pace and pulled out one earbud, but the noise didn't stop. It was somewhere ahead, maybe 20 yards in the fog. I thought of turning back, but pride got in the way. I'd been on this trail 100 times. It was safe. It had to be. The humming grew clearer as I jogged forward. It wasn't pleasant. There was something off about it, like the singer didn't care whether the note sounded right, only that it filled the silence. Then through the fog, I saw her. She was standing barefoot in the middle of the path, wearing a nightgown so thin the mist clung to it, turning the fabric darker in patches. Her hair hung in tangled clumps, wet against her shoulders. In one hand, she clutched something small, her fingers curled tight around it, as if afraid it would be taken. For a moment, I thought it was just a lump of fabric, but as I got closer, the shape came into focus. It was a finger. A severed finger, pale and stiff, still wearing a gold wedding band. My legs locked up before my mind caught up. I stopped a few yards away, the damp air heavy between us. The humming stopped as soon as I saw what she was holding. She looked up, and though her eyes seemed unfocused, she fixed them on me with a sudden sharpness that made my skin crawl. "He took everything," she whispered. Her voice was raw, cracked like she hadn't spoken in days. "He hid it under the floorboards, under the walls. You have to look there." I opened my mouth to say something, to offer help, maybe, or ask if she was hurt, but no words came out. She stepped toward me, bare feet silent on the wet pavement, and raised the finger slightly, as if presenting evidence. "They never listen. You'll listen, won't you?" Before I could move, the sound of sirens drifted faintly through the fog. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but the rising wail grew louder. She stiffened her head, jerking toward the sound like an animal hearing a hunter. Then, without another word, she bolted. She ran into the mist, her nightgown vanishing in the shifting gray. Within seconds, she was gone, swallowed whole by the fog. The sirens cut closer. Red and blue lights bled faintly through the haze, then sharpened as a police cruiser pulled into the trailhead lot behind me. An officer stepped out, flashlight cutting through the mist. He asked if I was the one who had called. I shook my head, still unable to form a full sentence. Another patrol car arrived seconds later. They spread out quickly, voices sharp, their beams slicing the fog in all directions. When I finally found words, I told them about the woman, about the humming, about the finger. The younger officer's eyes narrowed, but the older one didn't look surprised. He just sighed, muttered something into his radio, and told me to wait by the car. Later, one of them came back and said they'd found no trace of her on the trail. No footprints, no signs of anyone running barefoot through the wet gravel. But the call that brought them there was real. Someone had reported a break-in less than a mile away. A man attacked in his own home, his wife missing. I didn't press for details. They didn't offer any. I drove home, shaking the defrost, barely keeping up with the condensation on my windshield. I washed my running shoes twice that morning, though they weren't dirty. The smell of damp earth clung to them anyway. The next day, a short piece ran in the paper about a woman escaping a psychiatric facility in the area. No name given, just a line about her being dangerous and delusional. They mentioned her husband had been injured during the escape. There was no mention of a finger, no mention of her wandering the river trail. I told Megan I was fine, that I just didn't feel like running outside anymore. She laughed, assuming I was finally listening to her advice about safer hours. I didn't correct her. I let her think I'd simply grown tired of running in the dark. But sometimes when the fog rolls in thick off the river, I hear it again in the back of my mind, the faint humming low and steady, with no care for melody. And I see her eyes cutting sharp through the mist, holding out that finger, like proof of something I was never meant to see. I grew up thinking the worst part of late-night driving was the chance of hitting a deer. That belief stayed with me until the spring of 2017, when my sister Megan and I made a trip to Phoenix that has never left either of us the same. At the time, I was 25, living in Salt Lake City and working as a dental hygienist. Megan had just turned 21 and was finishing her nursing degree at BYU. We'd made the drive to Phoenix many times before to visit our aunt, usually leaving late to avoid traffic. It was a routine that felt familiar, almost comforting. That night, we left around 8:30, planning to reach our aunt's house in the early morning hours. The air was crisp and dry, the stars unusually sharp overhead, and the long stretch of highway south of Cedar City was empty, except for the occasional set of headlights. About 2 hours into the drive, I noticed a car following us. At first, it seemed harmless, just another vehicle heading south. But it stayed in my rearview mirror for far longer than I expected, never passing, never dropping back. The rhythm of its presence became distracting, a set of lights hovering just close enough to feel deliberate. Megan was dozing in the passenger seat, her feet propped on the dashboard, despite my complaints. The glow of the radio dial washing her face pale in the dark. Then the lights closed the gap between us. Red and blue flashed suddenly against my rearview mirror, reflecting in the windshield. It wasn't a marked cruiser, just a plain sedan with a dash-mounted beacon. I'd heard about unmarked cars being used on rural highways, so I eased onto the narrow shoulder. Gravel popped under the tires as I slowed to a stop. The car pulled in behind us. I watched through the mirror as a tall man stepped out. He wore dark jeans and a plain black windbreaker. No uniform, no reflective vest. His flashlight beam stayed aimed at the ground instead of into my window. I rolled it down just 2 inches, enough for him to speak. He leaned close, his face sharp in the reflected light. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, with a scar curving from his left ear down toward his jaw, like someone had pressed a hook into his skin and pulled. "License and registration," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. It carried none of the usual authority, no explanation of why he'd stopped us. My stomach turned cold. I reached slowly into my purse, watching his hand hover near his hip as if resting on something holstered. Megan had woken up fully by then, sitting perfectly still beside me. Her breathing was shallow, her nails pressing crescents into my arm. Then he said it flat, rehearsed. "Both of you step out of the vehicle." The phrasing wasn't right. It wasn't a question or even a polite order. It was too forceful, too final. Something inside me locked into place, a quiet certainty that if we stepped out, we wouldn't be seen again. I tried to sound calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked. He didn't answer, only repeated the command, louder this time. "Out of the vehicle. Now." That was the moment the second set of headlights appeared behind him. A marked sheriff's cruiser rolled up, the word sheriff gleaming across its side. A uniformed deputy stepped out, her hand on her radio, her other hand already near her weapon. The man with the scar froze. His jaw tightened. For a split second, he looked directly at me through the glass, frustration sharp in his eyes. The deputy's voice rang out clear. "Step away from that vehicle. Hands where I can see them." Her tone left no room for debate. He hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. Even then, his eyes didn't leave us. They tracked Megan in particular, studying her face as though memorizing it. What followed unfolded quickly. Within minutes, backup arrived, sirens cutting through the stillness of the desert. The unmarked sedan was searched, deputies moving with tense efficiency. I watched from behind the locked doors of my car, shaking, while the scarred man was handcuffed and placed in the back of the cruiser. The female deputy Vasquez approached us afterward. She leaned into the beam of my headlights, her face lined with anger and relief. "You did the right thing, staying in your car," she said. "We've been after him for months. Calls himself Nathan Crow. That's not his real name." She explained that he had been impersonating officers across Utah, Nevada, and Colorado, pulling over women traveling alone or in pairs. Always late at night, always on isolated stretches of highway. They had connected him to at least 4 attempted abductions. In one case, in Colorado, he had managed to get a woman out of her car before being interrupted. She had been found hours later at a rest stop alive, but shaken abandoned miles from where she was taken. They showed us what they had found in his vehicle: zip ties, duct tape, a police scanner tuned to local channels, and a full uniform complete with a badge that looked official under low light. In the glove compartment was a notebook filled with descriptions of cars and license plates. One deputy shut it quickly, but I caught a glimpse of Megan's name and the color of our car scribbled on one of the pages. We gave our statements right there on the side of the highway, the desert wind whispering through sagebrush. Megan didn't speak at all, only gripped my hand so tightly it left marks. Deputy Vasquez stayed near us the entire time, her presence steady, as though she knew exactly how close things had come to ending differently. They escorted us to the next town, a marked cruiser trailing us the whole way. When we finally reached our aunt's house in Phoenix the next morning, neither of us could sleep. We just sat in silence, the weight of his stare still pressing against the back of our minds. Months later, we testified at his trial. He was convicted, sentenced to 18 years, his record of impersonation and attempted abductions stretching further than we wanted to know. When the verdict was read, he sat expressionless, eyes fixed forward. But I couldn't shake the memory of him looking at us through the glass of my window, calm and certain as if he believed we were already his. To this day, whenever I see red and blue lights flicker in my rearview mirror, my chest tightens. Real officers tell you to call 911 if you're unsure, that they don't mind the extra caution. I've never forgotten that. But what lingers most isn't the relief of surviving. It's the way his eyes followed us in that last moment, like the hunt had been interrupted but never truly ended. Back in 2018, a shortcut someone sketched for us still shows up when I close my eyes. I can see the paper, the grease fingerprints, and the thin pencil line leading away from the interstate like a vein into blank desert. It didn't look menacing at the time, just an idea from a stranger who whistled when he spoke, and said we'd save a couple of hours if we knew where to turn. I believed him because I wanted to get there faster, and because at 20, I thought getting lost was a kind of adventure you could later claim on purpose. We were 3 Michigan kids in a borrowed Ford Ranger headed west, planning to cut down toward Winslow before pushing on to New Mexico. The truck belonged to Mason's older brother, and it had a rattle that woke up whenever we hit 60. We stopped at a little shop outside Holbrook, where the mechanic, a man with a gap in his front teeth, said the heat shield was loose, but nothing serious. He tightened a bolt, took our cash, then flipped over the receipt and drew a neat little map with the side of a dull pencil. "Turn off at mile marker 47, he said, tapping the paper with a blackened thumbnail. "Follow the old cattle road. When you see a yellow water tower hang a left, you'll miss a whole stretch of traffic." His voice whistled through that gap on every S like air escaping a tire. It was early afternoon, the desert bright and hard. The Ranger's air conditioner worked in short bursts, then gave up, so we rolled down the windows and let the heat scour our arms. Evan rode shotgun and kept letting his hand surf the air. He had a new phone and liked to take pictures of anything abandoned. I sat in the middle with knees pressed to the glove box, studying the map like it was a treasure we'd earned for being friendly. Mason drove with one wrist draped over the wheel and said it would be fine because old roads used to be straight. It was the kind of logic that makes perfect sense when you're 20 and the day still feels wide. The turnoff was nothing more than a gap in the guardrail, just where the receipt said it would be. A dirt track peeled away from the highway and ran flat across red earth toward a low line of hills. We bumped down onto it, and the interstate fell quiet behind us, replaced by the steady rasp of tires on packed clay. For the first few miles, it felt like the mechanic had done us a favor. The track was wide enough, the rattle quieter at a lower speed, the horizon big and uncomplicated. We passed an old gas pump standing alone like a rusted statue. Then a leaning shack with half its roof gone. Evan took pictures of both, promising to post them when we got a signal again. 5 or 6 miles in my phone went dead to the world. No bars, no emergency call symbol. The radio had turned to static sometime before that, so we shut it off and let the truck be the only sound. The sun had a way of flattening everything, making it hard to tell how far we'd driven. The map said the water tower would show up before 20 miles, but landmarks in the desert trick you. They slide around. We crossed 10, then 12 by Mason's estimate, and still nothing tall or yellow broke the horizon. We did see crosses. At first, just one made from 2 fence posts lashed together with wire and a strip of faded cloth. Then another a little farther along, decorated with a string of plastic flowers, whitened by the sun. After that, they appeared with a rhythm that made conversation thin out. Every 100 yards or so, a cross tilted in the wind, draped with things that didn't belong to it. Keys, ribbon scraps, a child's toy car. The breeze lifted the ribbon ends and made them whisper against the wood. Evan put his phone down. He said he didn't want that particular souvenir. The road narrowed and the surface went from hard-packed to ribbed and loose. Mason had to slow to keep the truck from fishtailing. A cloud of fine dust rose behind us and hung like a second sky in the rearview mirror. We made a decision without saying it out loud. We'd go just a little farther to the yellow tower the mechanic had promised, then make the left and be done with this detour. Stubbornness is the cousin of hope when you're in the middle of nowhere. We found the shoes before we found anything else. A single, small sneaker dangled from the lowest branch of a mesquite tree, its pink fabric bleached almost white. Then another tree, with two boots swinging side by side. Then around a slow bend a stand of trees filled with hundreds of them. Sandals with cracked straps, work boots with torn tongues running shoes, whose laces had fused into stiff cords. They turned gently in the air and made a soft, creaking sound. Some looked new. Others looked like they had been hanging so long they had become part of the branches. It was the quiet that made me uneasy, the way the sound of the creak fit so neatly into the wind that if you listened too long, you couldn't tell which was which. The farmstead sat beyond the shoe trees, and it wasn't ruined enough to be empty or whole enough to be alive. The house had a corner collapsed, and a black window like a missing eye. The barn was wide, and someone had nailed doll parts to its outside walls. Not in a pattern not like art, just arms and legs and heads in no order, the sun peeling their paint in strips. The strangest thing was the circle of baby carriages in the yard, all facing inward, as if waiting for something to appear. Some were modern strollers. Some were the old pram kind with big wheels like bicycle rims. Wind chimes hung from the porch, and they were the wrong color. At first I thought they were wood, then I thought they might be bone. The sound they made was thin and hollow, as if the wind had to work harder to move through them. An old school bus without wheels blocked most of the driveway. Its paint had blistered and peeled, leaving streaks that made it look skinned. Across the side, someone had painted words in a broad red hand, Matthew 19:14. Evans said the verse aloud under his breath, but none of us knew the rest of it. I was the first to see the figure in the barn loft. A shape where no shape should have been perfectly still in a dark, square window. I didn't point right away because pointing makes a thing more real. When I finally said I saw someone, the shape didn't move. It watched in that way you can feel more than see, a pressure against your chest rather than an action. The truck idled. The heat through the windshield pressed against our faces. Mason slid the gear shift into reverse and let the truck roll, the mirror groaning as it brushed a sheet of metal leaning against something unseen. We would have left neatly if the road behind us hadn't filled with a truck we hadn't heard arrive. It was an old Chevy Primer Gray with a mismatched door angled across the dirt, the way a bar slides across a cage. Two men got out. They didn't hurry. They walked like people who had done this walk many times, carrying something each of us tried not to identify. One wore an apron like a butcher's, the front, dark in a way that made it look wet even though the day blistered everything dry. The house door opened with a long, aching scrape, and a woman came out moving in a stuttered way as if every third step failed to complete itself. She dragged something behind her, and it left a line in the dirt that looked heavier than a chain would have looked. She didn't look at us. She looked past us toward the barn like she was waiting for a signal. "I'm going forward," Mason said, which made no sense because forward was blocked, but sometimes forward means anything that isn't back. He cranked the wheel and found a shallow gap between the bus and a heap of rusted farm equipment. The truck's passenger side mirror screamed as it scraped paint, and we bumped over something I didn't see. For a second, the circle of carriages filled the windshield, and all I could think about was how their wheels didn't line up how each one had been turned by hand. Then the gap widened into a narrow track that cut away at an angle, more suggestion than road. We took it. The ranger shook like an animal trying to shed flies. A glance in the mirror showed the gray Chevy dropping in behind us with lazy confidence. Beyond it, dust rose in a second plume as another vehicle turned to follow. The track twisted among trees with white trunks that stood like bones, and it felt like driving through a rib cage. I told myself I would look later to see if the trunks really were that pale, or if my brain simply wanted them to be. The washboard surface made the speedometer jump. Mason kept one eye on the temperature gauge and the other on the ruts. Evan faced backward with both hands on the headrest and said they were gaining. He sounded small, and Evan was not small. The air in the cab smelled like hot plastic. I saw the hole in the tailgate first in the mirror, a dark circle with a clean ring, neat and wrong. We hadn't heard a shot. There had been no crack in the air, no echo across the flats, just the hole, and the knowledge that comes with the shape of a hole like that. The track climbed, then bent hard around a rock outcrop and widened suddenly into a better-maintained dirt road. Mason turned right because right existed, and sometimes that is enough. We pushed the Ranger harder than it wanted to go. The gauge crept toward the red. The road rose again and gave us a blind curve we entered too fast. When we came around it, a sheriff's cruiser filled the lane. Mason braked so hard the world tilted. The truck stopped sideways with the right rear wheel kissing the ditch. The deputy stepped out with one hand on his holster and took us in all at once, 3 kids out of place and covered in dust. He looked calm in the way you want law to look, and also bored in a careful way, as if bored was the safest mask to wear. Evan was out of the truck first, words jammed against each other. He talked about the mechanic, the map, the shoes, the barn, the circle of carriages, the men, the woman, the bullet hole. He tried to point back down the road, but when we all turned, there was nothing. No dust plume, no vehicles, just a clean line of desert where we had expected proof. The deputy's face didn't change. He walked around. The ranger instead rounded a finger across the hole in the tailgate, then glanced at each of us like he was fitting us into a shape he already knew. He told us to breathe. Then he told us to follow him slowly. He drove in front with his turn signals blinking long before the turns arrived, taking roads I hadn't noticed on the way in. Sometimes they were nothing more than pale runs between low brush. Sometimes they were nearly paved with crushed stone. It took 20 quiet minutes to reach the interstate, though the drive back felt shorter than the way in. We pulled off at the on-ramp and he came to my window, which I had already rolled down 2 inches without deciding to. "You boys were lucky," he said. The words didn't sound like comfort. "You wandered onto private land. Folks out there don't welcome company." He paused like he was choosing a weight for each word. "Best you don't make a report. Best you be grateful." He waited until Mason pulled the Ranger up onto the asphalt and merged with a world that suddenly felt too normal. Then he turned around and drove back the way we had come, his taillights shrinking until they went out. We didn't stop until we hit a bright truck stop an hour down the highway. We sat in the cab and listened to the fan run after the engine was off, and no one suggested burgers. Mason said the bullet hole must have been there before, and we had missed it. He said it twice, then didn't say it again. Evan stared at the reflection of fluorescent lights in the windshield until the shapes dissolved into one long band. We changed our plans in the morning, and pointed the truck back toward home. The map on the receipt went into the trash at a motel somewhere on the way because none of us wanted to look at it. I searched for that area afterward on my laptop using every combination of words I could think of: old cattle, road mile marker, 47 yellow water tower shoes in trees. Nothing useful ever came up. Nothing that looked like what we saw. It was as if the road we took didn't exist anymore, or if it did, it belonged to people who preferred it that way. On some nights when I wake at the same time for no good reason, I can hear those chimes again, thin and hollow, moving the air only a little. I tell myself it is the house settling, or a branch against the siding. Then I think of the mechanic's pencil line leading away from the interstate. I think of his whistle and his smile when he handed me the receipt. I have never been able to shake the feeling that he knew exactly where he was sending us, and that we weren't the first ones who trusted the map. I've stopped at a lot of rest areas in my life, and most of them blur together. A row of vending machines humming under fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee that's been hot too long, the echo of shoes on tile. But there's one place I remember clearer than any of the others, and it wasn't because of the coffee or the bathrooms, or even the quiet. It was because of a man who knew things he shouldn't have, and the way he looked at a woman like she was already his. It was March of 2014, and I was hauling west out of Kansas, bound for Bakersfield with a load of machine parts. I pulled off at a rest stop near Flagstaff around 2 in the morning. The place was almost empty, except for one sedan parked under a buzzing light. The desert air was cold enough to make my teeth ache as I crossed the lot. Inside, the lobby was lit too bright for the hour, that hospital kind of brightness that shows every crack in the tile. A woman sat alone at one of the plastic tables with a paper cup in her hands. She looked tired but alert, like someone who had been driving too long and couldn't quite relax. I got coffee from the machine and nodded a hello. She gave me a polite smile in return, the kind strangers give each other when they're both out too late and trying to stay civil. I took a seat a few tables away. It was quiet enough that I could hear the humming of the vending machines change pitch now and then, like they were sighing in their sleep. That was when he walked in. He didn't look unusual at first glance, just a man in his late 40s with neatly pressed clothes and hair combed too carefully. But the moment he entered, the air seemed to lose some of its ease. He walked straight toward the woman without even glancing around the room. I saw her stiffen before he said anything, like she had already felt his eyes on her. He sat across from her and leaned forward with both hands flat on the table. "Claire," he said, smiling like he'd been waiting for her. "I told you I'd find you." Her face changed in a way I can still see clearly. It wasn't recognition. It was confusion mixed with fear, the kind of expression that says someone else's mistake has landed too close. She told him her name wasn't Claire. She said he had the wrong person, but he just shook his head slowly, still smiling. Then he started telling her things, details about a job she supposedly had in Albuquerque, the apartment she supposedly rented above a laundromat, the dog she supposedly owned that barked at the mailman every morning. His voice was calm, almost tender, but each detail made her flinch more. I could feel the back of my neck tighten as I listened. I wanted to believe he'd mistaken her for someone else, but the way he spoke made it sound like he wasn't mistaken at all. It was as if he had chosen her, and the life he described was less a confusion and more a story he had written in advance. She told him again to stop louder this time, and that was when he leaned closer and whispered something I couldn't hear. Her hand trembled so hard she almost spilled the coffee. I stood up then, telling myself I'd refill my cup just to be closer, in case she needed an excuse to move. The man turned and looked at me, and in that glance I felt something cold slide into the room. His eyes weren't angry, but they were fixed in a way that said I had interrupted something private. I told him she didn't seem to know him, that maybe he ought to give her some space. He smiled at me the same way he'd smiled at her, only this time it was thinner, stretched too far. He said, "She always finds someone to hide behind." The woman pushed her chair back and stood clutching her bag to her side. She asked if I could walk her to her car. I said of course, and we started toward the door together. The man didn't move right away, but as the glass doors slid open and the cold night hit us, I heard his footsteps following. They were slow, measured, the kind of steps meant to remind you he was still there. Out in the parking lot, the fluorescent light flickered above us, and the shadows it threw made the spaces between cars look deeper than they should have. She quickened her pace toward the sedan. I matched her stride. When we reached it, she fumbled the keys, dropping them once before getting the door open. That was when the man's steps stopped. He stood about 20 feet away, just outside the reach of the buzzing light, his hands in his pockets, smiling still. I told her to get in and lock the doors. She did, starting the engine with hands that shook so badly she had to try twice. The man didn't move until her headlights hit him. Then he raised one hand in a slow, almost friendly wave, as if this had all been a reunion cut short. She drove off, fast tires crunching against the gravel. I stayed where I was until the sound of her car faded. When I turned back, the man was gone. No footsteps, no other vehicles leaving the lot, nothing but the cold and the buzzing light. I went back inside and sat with my coffee until dawn, telling myself I'd imagined the weight of that stare. But I hadn't. A week later, when I was home in Kansas, I mentioned it to a friend who worked in law enforcement. He made a call to an Arizona state trooper named Brewster, who told him it wasn't the first time. A man with the same description had been reported at other rest stops, always approaching women late at night, always insisting he knew them, always describing lives that weren't theirs, but could have been close enough to someone else's. Sometimes the women drove away. Sometimes they froze until someone else intervened. No one had ever caught him, and no one knew his name. The reports just called him the Quiet Man. It's been 10 years, and I still think about that woman in the rest stop. I don't know if her name was Marie, or if she ever made it safely wherever she was headed. What I do know is that when the man looked at me that night, it was like he was deciding whether I belonged in his story too. And when I wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, I sometimes imagine footsteps outside my window, slow and measured, waiting for me to open the door so he can tell me who I really am. Back in T11, I took a detour that changed everything. I didn't mean to take it, and I can't say exactly where it began because the road we followed later refused to show up on any map. It started like most wrong turns do, with tired minds and daylight that felt crumpled at the edges. We were 4 kids in a van pushing hard toward the Pacific because we believed the ocean was a finish line you could cross if you just kept your foot steady on the gas. We had left a worn-out motel in southern New Mexico that morning. The kind of place where the carpet smelled like damp cardboard and the ice machine rattled like it had ghosts. Des had the keys to a dented teal van. His uncle gave him an old Aerostar with a half-working radio and a sliding door that needed a firm shoulder. Luke and Cade were in the back with the cooler, and I rode shotgun with a film. Camera across my lap, because everything looked better through glass that didn't blink. By late morning, we pulled off at a small diner set back from a frontage road. The sign buzzed, the coffee came hot enough to burn a slow line down your throat, and the waitress called us Hun without looking up from her order pad. The only other person outside was a man leaning on a rust-colored pickup studying our license plate like it was a word he was trying to sound out. He didn't come in and he didn't smile. He stood there with a stillness that didn't fit the heat. We ate fast. Luke swore the guy never took his eyes off the van, but when we paid and stepped into the glare, the pickup was gone. No engine noise, no dust trail, just a rectangle of darker gravel where it had been. Des laughed and said we needed sleep and better stories. None of us argued because arguing would have made it bigger. The highway ran long and flat after that. The same landscape repeated until the radio hissed to static, and the windshield glare turned everything into silhouettes. I drifted off somewhere past noon and woke to the van sitting still, in a place that looked like it had been built to make you forget which direction you were facing. The road had ended against rows of corrugated metal buildings scabbed with faded logos. Loading docks sat empty like open mouths, and the sunlight lay over everything in a hard sheet that made the air feel thin. Des kept both hands on the wheel and didn't answer when I asked why we'd stopped. Cade stood outside the van, squinting like he expected a foreman to appear with a clipboard and a reason for us to be there. Luke stared at his phone, even though there was no signal scrolling God knows what on a dead screen, because movement felt safer than stillness. I stepped out to stretch and immediately felt the kind of silence you only notice after a long drive. It wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of heat pressing down on metal and wires humming behind walls. No people, no traffic on any nearby road. The van's engine ticked as it cooled, and I could hear the faint squeal of a loose sign somewhere that turned in a lazy circle. "What are we waiting for?" I asked. "Not far off track," Cade said, repeating it like a line he had been given. "We're supposed to meet someone," Luke added, still looking at his blank phone. It wasn't sarcasm. It sounded like a schedule he didn't remember agreeing to. I went for a soda from the cooler and saw it paper tucked under the wiper blade, folded into a neat square like a bill. I opened it and found pencil letters pressed hard enough to dent the page. 4 words. "You're almost out west." There was no name, no phone number, no direction. Just the kind of message that pretends to be helpful while not telling you what you need to know. "Did one of you leave this?" I asked. Des looked at the note and shrugged as if I had shown him a receipt from a place he'd never been. "People leave junk," he said, and turned the key halfway. The engine coughed and died. He tried again with the same result. "We'll let it sit," he said, which didn't make sense because motors don't catch their breath, but it also didn't sound wrong. It sounded like something you say inside a space that doesn't want you to think too hard. The sun crawled. Shadows from the warehouse roofs slid slowly. Across the lot, drawing lines that felt like clocks. I took a picture to kill the feeling framing the dock doors and the empty sky. When I developed it later, the negative came back mostly gray, like the light had been swallowed and spit back flat. At the time, I didn't know that yet. I only knew the air tasted like hot pennies and that my friends had stopped sounding like themselves. I said we should leave the van and walk to the frontage road. Des told me not to, not angry, just firm. "You won't find it," he said. The phrase was simple, but it lodged somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there. I decided to go anyway, because compliance felt like stepping backward into a room with no doors. The buildings repeated with strange symmetry, long metal walls broken by doors that didn't seem to open. I kept the sun on my left and counted steps out loud so I could retrace them later. 30 counts, then 60, then 120. I could hear my breathing and the occasional clink of something settling in the heat. Every time I stopped, the air stopped with me, and for a few seconds the place felt like it was holding its breath. I turned back when the sameness became a slope in my stomach. I should have come out where we started, but I didn't. I emerged into a different lot facing a different angle of buildings. A forklift sat stripped of its wheels near a chain-link fence, and a stack of pallets leaned into a shadow that didn't make sense for the hour. I walked in a square, then a long rectangle trying to feel the geometry of the place, and somehow stepped behind a warehouse where the ground dipped toward a freight spur. Lights flickered above the platform like they were getting power from a source that didn't want to share. When I finally found our lot again, the van was gone. There were no tracks, no oil spot, no dropped soda can to prove we had been there. Just open space under a flicker of light that returned to steady the second I saw it. I called their names until the echoes skittered into the corners and died. I banged on a loading bay door and felt cheap metal shiver but not give. The sweat dried on my skin and left a film that made me feel miswired. I don't remember sitting down, but I must have. The sun slid and took its hard light with it, and then I was somewhere else entirely, a different corner of the district near a freight yard, with cracked concrete painted the color of dust. I had the sense of time snapping like a reel catching in a projector, and then there were headlights moving slow. A trucker stopped and opened his door and asked if I was hurt. His face looked like a map older men keep folded in their glove box to remind themselves they can still read. He brought me to a clinic on the city's edge where the AC worked too well, and the walls were painted a shade of blue that hospital designers believe calms people. I tried to explain about the note and the van, about my friends, about how the buildings had made a maze that didn't want to be solved. The nurse nodded because it was her job to nod. The police nodded because paperwork goes faster. When everyone agrees on basic shapes, they said I was dehydrated and probably disoriented from the heat. They said it happens to travelers. They took the words, "You're almost out west," and laid them flat until they sounded harmless. 2 days later, someone found Dez's van at a shipping terminal outside the city. Doors locked, keys in the ignition like a car you leave a friend while you duck inside for a quick errand. Our bags were still there, and in a greasy paper sack on the floor was a fast food receipt dated 48 hours after the afternoon. I stood in the lot alone. None of us had bought it, which is the sort of sentence you learn to leave out of official statements if you want people to keep listening. I told the detective about the man by the diner who stared at our plate. He wrote it down slowly and asked what kind of truck it was and if I remembered the plate. I didn't, and it felt like handing back a tool with the wrong handle. They asked for pictures, and I gave them the frame I shot of the loading docks. The lab returned. It washed out and strange. The detective said it was overexposed. I didn't argue because what else was I supposed to say? That the light had eaten it from the inside. Weeks went by. Friends of friends called to ask if Des or Luke or Cade had turned up back home, putting question marks at the ends of their sentences that didn't sound hopeful. Then a different kind of silence arrived. Records began to thin. An old classmate swore Luke's DMV entry didn't pull up anymore, like the database had been trimmed with careful scissors. Cade's name came up blank on a social media profile that used to hold pictures of him laughing into a campfire smoke he pretended not to mind. I searched their names late at night from my parents' desktop and got tired of seeing unrelated faces and men with similar haircuts who weren't them. I still have a photograph from the morning we left that motel. It shows the three of them leaning against the van with the service road behind them and the sky bleached to white by the sun. I had it scanned and backed up in 3 places because I'm not confident in anything that claims to be permanent. When the house is quiet, I take the printout and study their expressions like they might twitch if I look long enough. Des is squinting with the same half grin he used when the engine sound worried him. Luke is trying to look serious and failing. Cade has his hands in his pockets because he didn't know what to do with them when someone else was holding the camera. I hear from time to time that a certain warehouse district outside El Paso is being redeveloped, that new storefronts will bring life to all that dead metal and concrete. Maybe that's true. Maybe the buildings came down and the lots are clean and square under kinder light. It would make sense. Cities shed skin and call it progress. Yet even now, if I wake in the small hours and the fridge motor clicks on, I think I hear a loose sign turn once and then again. I picture a folded square of paper catching wind and sliding under a wiper blade like it has a destination. I kept the note. People always ask that part, and yes, I kept it. The pencil marks have faded a little, but you can still see where whoever wrote it pressed hard enough to score the paper. You're almost out west. Almost is a word that can hold an ocean in its mouth. Almost means you never quite arrive. Almost means you stop in a place that looks like any other, and the people who were beside you a moment ago are suddenly standing somewhere you don't have a map for. Every so often when traffic noise thins late at night, my phone will light with a blocked number. There's never a message and never a name. I don't answer anymore. I just sit there and listen to the ring fade soft and final, like something finishing its walk across an empty lot. Then I put the note back in the envelope and tell myself the ocean is still there, beyond the desert, beyond whatever district the map forgot, waiting for the people who made it all the way. I spent a stretch of my 30s on the road, driving from small town to small town, with a briefcase full of forms that no one really wanted to sign. My job was to inspect storm damage talk to policyholders and write up claims that kept them from losing everything. In 2014, a line of storms had pushed across Arkansas, snapping trees and peeling roofs like tin lids, and I was sent out to verify losses for a string of old properties near Pine Bluff. It was lonely work, most of it done in quiet houses that smelled like damp insulation and boiled coffee. Still, I preferred those places to the offices where the air always felt stale from recycled complaints. One afternoon, I was directed to a house that sat back from the county road, tucked under the black stretch of pine trees that leaned in like watchmen. The gravel drive was thin and rutted with weeds breaking through in stubborn patches, and when I parked, the first thing I noticed was the mailbox. Its paint was stripped bare, and on the side, someone had written in shaky marker, "Do not leave letters after dark." The ink had bled in the rain, but the message was still clear. I stared at it longer than I should have, then shook it off and went to the porch. The woman who answered was Evelyn Clark, a widow in her 70s, dressed in a cardigan despite the humidity. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked toward the trees, as if checking whether I had brought someone else. She led me through the front room, where the wallpaper peeled in thin curls, and I began taking notes about the shingles torn from the roof. She offered me water in a mason jar that smelled faintly of copper. I set it aside after one sip, telling myself I'd finish it later, though we both knew I wouldn't. The damage was straightforward. Wind had lifted part of the roof, and rain had soaked through the attic insulation. Still, she insisted I look at the back shed, saying the storm had blown the latch clean off. I followed her out the door, listening to the cicadas pressing their endless rhythm into the air, until we reached a leaning structure half swallowed by vines. The padlock hung open, but when I tugged the handle, the door barely gave. Inside, the gloom seemed thicker than it should have been for late afternoon, as if the boards were holding back more than just shadows. "You'll want to make note," Evelyn said, her voice too level, "but don't go inside. Not today." I asked if she stored tools there, and she shook her head slowly. "It was my husband's place. He kept it locked always. He's been gone 10 years, but some doors don't open just because you lose the key." Her words seemed rehearsed, like something she had told herself many times. Back in the house, I filled out her claim form. She signed with a trembling hand and then placed the pen carefully beside the paper, as though she feared disturbing the air. As I gathered my things, I asked about the writing on the mailbox. She glanced toward the window and said, "You must leave before dusk. People forget, but this road doesn't forgive the ones who linger." I thought it might be superstition, the kind of folklore rural places collect like moss, but something in her tone made me want to believe her. By the time I started the van, the sun was sliding down between the trees, and the gravel under my tires sounded too loud. I checked the rearview mirror and saw Evelyn standing on her porch, arms folded tightly, watching, until I turned onto the county road. The air was thick with the smell of pine tar, and the last light stretched long between the branches. I drove slow, scanning for the highway sign, but after a few minutes the road narrowed and the ditches drew closer until it felt like I was traveling through a tunnel. That was when I saw the first figure. Just a few yards ahead, a man stood at the shoulder, dressed in coveralls, stained dark down the front. His face was shadowed by the trees, but his head tilted in a way that made me think he knew me. I slowed, but when the headlights reached him, he was gone. Not vanished in a blink, just no longer. There, as if I had mistaken an outline for a person. My chest tightened. I told myself it was heat rising off the asphalt or the tiredness from long days on the road. Another mile passed and a second figure appeared. This time it was a woman in a faded dress standing in the ditch with her back to me. As I drew closer, she turned her head slowly, and I caught a pale reflection of eyes that seemed to glimmer without catching the light. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles throbbed. When I blinked, she too was gone, and the ditch lay empty except for weeds trembling in the night breeze. I pushed the van faster, heart racing until the road widened into a clearing with a gas station set back from the corner. The pumps looked long dead, and the windows were covered in plywood, yet a light glowed faintly inside, like a lantern left too long. I pulled into the lot, thinking maybe I could ask for directions, but the second I cut the engine, the glow winked out, leaving me with nothing but the tick of the cooling motor and the thick drone of insects. I didn't stay to investigate. I turned the key again and pressed the pedal hard, following the road as if it might punish me if I slowed. When I finally reached the highway, the air seemed to break open, full of distant noise and the ordinary rush of passing cars. My shoulders loosened, though the relief was shallow, like waking from a dream, where you still feel the echo of what chased you. I pulled into a diner just outside Pine Bluff, my shirt stuck to my back. The waitress poured me coffee without asking, and I remember staring at the clock above the register. It read 9:17. Yet I could have sworn I left Evelyn's house at 5:30. 3 hours had dissolved into a stretch of road I couldn't account for. The next week, when I filed her paperwork, I asked a local deputy about the Clark property. Deputy Rollins frowned and said the house had been abandoned for years. No one's lived there since Old Man Clark died in 2004, he told me. I described Evelyn the cardigan, the mason jar of water, the shed behind the house. He shook his head slowly. That place is condemned. Don't go back out there. Some roads hold on to you. I didn't argue, because deep down I already knew I wouldn't return. I had seen something I couldn't fold neatly into my reports, something that didn't belong on paper. I still think about the mailbox, the warning scrawled by a hand that must have trembled, reminding strangers to leave before dark. Maybe Evelyn wrote it. Maybe she wanted someone else to learn the rule before the road decided to teach it. Either way, I can't shake the thought that I left just in time, and that staying another half hour might have meant I never left at all. That was the last memory I'll share tonight. Thinking back on all these accounts, I realize they were never about grand tragedies or blood-soaked legends. They were about small places that most people pass by without noticing, where something quiet lingers beneath the surface. A warehouse lot in the desert, a stretch of highway in the fog, a shed that never really opens. Each one held something that didn't want to be explained. The truth is, what unsettles me most isn't what I saw, but the pieces that never quite added up. The missing hours, the vanishing faces, the roads that seemed to bend away from maps. These stories remind me that dread often hides in the ordinary, in the corners we don't think to examine, until the silence presses too hard. And sometimes the scariest thing is realizing that not all of it stayed behind. Some of it followed me home in memories that stir when the house is still and the clock ticks louder than it should. If you've listened this far, maybe you've felt it too, that sense of something unseen waiting just past the edge of the familiar. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I hope these stories kept you company tonight and gave you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe. Share this with a friend and follow along for future nights. And tell me, have you ever been on a road or in a place that felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain? I'd like to hear your story too.